Every night, a golden retriever named Max stands guard over a homeless man named George, braving the cold and dangers of the city streets. But what's truly miraculous isn't just Max's loyalty. It's what happens next that changes both their lives forever. George had been living on the streets for years, forgotten by society and surviving one day at a time. His only companion was Max, a stray dog who had appeared one freezing winter night and never left his side. Max wasn't just a friend, he was George's protector, standing watch while George slept and alerting him to any threats. Their nights were often filled with challenges, angry passers-by, rough weather, and the ever-present uncertainty of life without shelter. Yet, Max's unwavering loyalty gave George a sense of security he hadn't felt in years. Max seemed to sense George's vulnerability, curling up beside him to share warmth and always standing between him and potential harm. One particularly cold evening, George and Max settled into their usual spot near an abandoned alley. As George drifted off, Max's ears perked up, his sharp instincts sensing something unusual. A figure approached from the shadows, and Max stood his ground, barking fiercely to deter any threat. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events neither George nor Max could have imagined. George woke up to the sound of Max barking furiously. His heart pounded as he quickly assessed his surroundings. A man stood a few feet away, frozen in place under the glow of a flickering streetlight. His hands were raised in a gesture of surrender, his face a mix of fear and curiosity. "Easy, boy," George murmured, placing a hand on Max's back. The golden retriever's tense posture relaxed slightly, though his gaze never wavered from the stranger. "I'm not here to hurt you," the man said, his voice trembling slightly. I saw the dog and wanted to check if everything was okay." George didn't respond immediately. Years of hardship had taught him to be cautious of strangers. "We're fine," he said gruffly, pulling his thin blanket tighter around his shoulders. The man hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. Max growled low, but George gently patted his side to reassure him. The man pulled out a sandwich wrapped in paper and extended it toward George. "Take it," he said. "It's fresh." George eyed the offering warily before finally accepting it. "Thanks," he muttered, breaking off a small piece and offering it to Max, who sniffed it before eating. The rest George devoured quickly, the simple meal warming his empty stomach. "I'm Paul, the man said, sitting on a nearby crate. "I run a cafe a few blocks from here. I've seen you and your dog around a few times." George glanced at him, unsure of what to make of this stranger's sudden interest. "Why do you care?" Paul shrugged. "I used to have a dog like him. Seeing you two reminded me of her." As the two men spoke cautiously, Max remained alert, his warm body pressed against George's side. Paul noticed the bond between them and smiled softly. "He's loyal," Paul remarked. "Not many dogs would stick around like that." George nodded. "Max saved my life more times than I can count. He's more than a dog, he's family." Paul listened as George recounted how Max had appeared one night, skinny and shivering, but with a spark of determination in his eyes. George had shared his meager meal with the stray, and from that night on they'd been inseparable. "He watches over me," George said, "keeps me safe. I don't know how I'd get by without him." The conversation was interrupted by a loud crash nearby. Max leapt to his feet, barking protectively. Paul stood, his expression tense. "This neighborhood isn't safe at night," he said. "You two shouldn't be out here." "Where else would we go?" George replied bitterly. Paul hesitated, then made a surprising offer. "Come to my cafe tomorrow. I'll make sure you both have a warm meal. No strings attached." George was skeptical but agreed reluctantly. As Paul walked away, Max sat beside George, wagging his tail slightly, as if sensing that the stranger's intentions were good. The next day, George and Max made their way to the cafe. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods filled the air, a stark contrast to the harsh streets. Paul greeted them warmly, setting down a plate of food and a bowl of water for Max. For the first time in years, George felt a small flicker of hope. Over the following weeks, Paul's kindness became a lifeline for George and Max. The cafe became a safe haven where they could rest and recharge. Paul even started leaving leftover food outside for other stray dogs in the area, inspired by Max's loyalty. Despite this newfound support, life on the streets was still a daily struggle. George faced constant judgment from passers-by, and Max's protective nature sometimes led to conflicts. But through it all, They had each other, and now they also had Paul. One rainy evening, George and Max returned to their spot in the alley. George leaned against the wall, pulling his coat tighter as the cold seeped into his bones. Max curled up beside him, his golden fur damp but still providing warmth. George's mind wandered to the life he had lost, a steady job, a home, and the simple comfort of not having to fight for survival every day. He looked down at Max, who was already asleep, and felt a pang of gratitude. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, buddy," he whispered. As George drifted off, he didn't notice the shadowy figure watching them from the other end of the alley. Max, however, was alert. His ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. The figure hesitated, then disappeared into the night. The next morning, George woke to find a small box placed near their sleeping spot. Inside was a blanket, a bag of dog food, and a note, "For Max and his brave owner. Keep going." George's eyes welled with tears. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not just as a homeless man, but as someone worth helping. He looked at Max, who wagged his tail happily, and felt a surge of determination. As the sun rose, George made a silent vow to himself and to Max. Their journey wasn't over, but they would face it together, one step at a time. George and Max arrived at Paul's cafe early the next morning, just as the first rays of sunlight spilled over the city skyline. The warmth of the cafe, with its inviting aroma of fresh coffee and pastries, was a stark contrast to the biting cold of the streets. Max wagged his tail excitedly, his golden fur gleaming in the sunlight, as Paul greeted them with a genuine smile. "Morning, you two," Paul said, setting down a steaming cup of coffee and a plate piled high with scrambled eggs and toast. For Max, he placed a bowl of fresh water and some leftover roast chicken from the day before. "Eat up. You look like you could use a proper meal." George sat down cautiously, still unaccustomed to this unexpected kindness. Max immediately began devouring his food, his tail thumping happily against the cafe floor. "I don't know how to thank you," George muttered, picking at his toast. "You don't have to," Paul replied, sitting across from him. "I've seen how much you care for Max. That kind of loyalty deserves to be supported." As George ate, Paul asked about his life. Slowly, haltingly, George began to open up. He spoke of his past, a steady job in construction, a modest apartment, and dreams of one day owning his own home. But when the company he worked for went under, he found himself without a safety net. Bills piled up, his landlord evicted him, and his friends disappeared when he needed them most. Max had come into his life at his lowest point, giving him a reason to keep going. "Max saved me," George said, scratching the dog behind his ears. "He's the only family I've got now." Paul listened intently, his expression a mix of sympathy and admiration. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "Most people in your situation would have given up. But you're still here, and that says a lot." George looked down at his coffee, his throat tightening with emotion. He wasn't used to hearing words of encouragement, especially from someone he barely knew. "I guess I don't have much of a choice," he said quietly. Over the following weeks, Paul's cafe became a haven for George and Max. The regulars began to recognize them, and some even brought treats for Max, who charmed everyone with his friendly demeanor. But not everyone was welcoming. A few patrons whispered behind George's back, casting judgmental glances at his worn clothes and weathered face. One afternoon, as George and Max sat in their usual corner, a well-dressed man approached Paul at the counter. "I've noticed that man and his dog here a lot lately," he said, his tone sharp. "Isn't it bad for business to have people like that hanging around?" Paul's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "George and Max are my guests, just like anyone else who walks through that door. If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to take your business elsewhere." The man huffed and stormed out, leaving Paul fuming. George, who had overheard the exchange, felt a familiar pang of shame. He started to gather his things, but Paul stopped him. "Don't let people like that get to you," he said firmly. "You belong here just as much as anyone else." George nodded, though the words did little to ease the knot in his stomach. Max leaned against him, sensing his unease, and licked his hand reassuringly. George smiled faintly, grateful for his unwavering companion. One evening, as George and Max returned to their spot in the alley, they found a group of teenagers loitering nearby. Their laughter echoed off the brick walls, but it wasn't friendly. George tensed, pulling Max closer as one of the boys stepped forward. "Nice dog," the boy sneered. "Bet he'd fetch a good price." "Leave us alone," George said, his voice steady but firm. The boy smirked. But before he could say anything else, Max stepped in front of George, baring his teeth and growling low. The other boys backed away nervously, dragging their ringleader with them. "Crazy mutt," one of them muttered as they disappeared into the night. George knelt beside Max, wrapping his arms around him. "Good boy," he whispered. "You've got my back, don't you?" The encounter shook George, but it also strengthened his resolve. He couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge and vulnerable. Max deserved better, and so did he. The next morning, George returned to the cafe, determined to ask Paul for advice. As they sat together over coffee, George explained his situation. "I can't do this anymore," he admitted. "Living on the streets, always looking over my shoulder. Max deserves a real home." Paul nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that too," he said. "I might have an idea, but it's going to take some work." "What kind of work?" George asked. His curiosity piqued. Paul smiled. "Let's just say you're not the only one who needs a second chance. Meet me here tomorrow, and I'll explain everything." The next morning, George and Max arrived at the cafe, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. Paul greeted them with his usual warmth, but there was a new glint of determination in his eyes. "Come with me," he said, grabbing his coat. Curious but hesitant, George followed Paul out of the cafe. Max trotted alongside them, his tail wagging as they made their way through the bustling streets. Paul led them to a small, dilapidated building a few blocks away. The faded sign above the door read, "Second Chances Shelter." Paul unlocked the door and ushered them inside. The space was dimly lit, with peeling paint on the walls and a faint smell of mildew in the air. But it was spacious, with several rooms branching off from the main hall. "This used to be a community center," Paul explained, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "It's been abandoned for years, but I've been working on fixing it up. I want to turn it into a shelter for people like you and their pets." George stared at Paul, stunned. "A shelter for people and their pets?" Paul nodded. "There are so many shelters that won't take in animals, which leaves people like you with nowhere to go. I've seen it too many times. This place could be different. It could give people a real chance to get back on their feet without having to give up the animals they love." George's throat tightened as he looked around the space. The idea seemed almost too good to be true. How do you plan to make this work?" Paul smiled. "So that's where you come in. I can't do this alone. I need someone I can trust to help me run this place. Someone who knows what it's like to live out there, who understands the people we're trying to help." George blinked, trying to process Paul's words. "You want me to help you? But I don't have any experience. I'm just trying to survive." "And you've been doing that better than most," Paul said firmly. "You've got grit, George. You've got empathy. Those are things you can't teach. Plus," he added with a grin, "Max will make a great mascot." George glanced at Max, who looked up at him with trusting eyes, as if to say, "We can do this." "I don't know," George said slowly. "It sounds big. Too big." Paul placed a hand on George's shoulder. "I'm not asking for an answer right now. Just think about it. Come back tomorrow and we'll talk more." That night, as George and Max settled into their usual spot, George couldn't stop thinking about Paul's proposal. The idea of having a purpose again, of building something meaningful, filled him with equal parts hope and fear. Could he really do it? Could he leave behind the life he had come to accept as his reality? Max curled up beside him, resting his head on George's lap. Stroking Max's soft fur, George felt a flicker of determination. "What do you think, buddy?" he murmured. "Think we can make a fresh start?" Max's tail thumped against the ground, as if in agreement. The next morning, George returned to the shelter with Max at his side. Paul was waiting for them, a clipboard in hand and a look of quiet confidence on his face. "Does this mean you're in?" he asked. George took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm in." Over the next few weeks, the shelter became their shared project. Paul taught George the basics of managing the space, organizing supplies, coordinating with volunteers, and maintaining the building. George, in turn, brought his own ideas to the table, suggesting ways to make the shelter more welcoming and effective. Max became a constant presence, greeting everyone who walked through the door with wagging tail and boundless enthusiasm. His cheerful energy lifted spirits and helped people feel at ease. Soon, word began to spread about the shelter, and people started showing up, each with their own stories of hardship, each with a loyal companion by their side. One evening, as George was sweeping the main hall, a woman arrived with a small, trembling terrier clutched in her arms. Her clothes were worn, her face lined with exhaustion. "I heard about this place," she said softly. "Is it true you take in people and their pets?" George set down his broom and approached her, his expression gentle. "That's right. You're safe here." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes as she looked around the shelter. "I've been turned away so many times. I didn't know where else to go." George guided her to a chair and brought her a blanket. "You don't have to explain," he said. "We've been there. You're not alone anymore." That night, as the woman and her terrier settled into one of the shelter's newly furnished rooms, George sat beside Max and reflected on how far they had come. The shelter was no longer just a building. It was a lifeline, a place where people could find hope and rebuild their lives. And for the first time in years, George felt a sense of pride, not just for himself, but for Max, whose unwavering loyalty had brought them to this moment. The shelter's first few weeks of operation were a whirlwind of activity, marked by both small victories and significant challenges. For George, adjusting to his new role as a caretaker and manager was both thrilling and overwhelming. The structure and responsibilities gave him a purpose he hadn't felt in years, but they also pushed him far outside his comfort zone. Max, on the other hand, adapted effortlessly. The golden retriever's warmth and cheerful demeanor made him a favorite among the shelter's residents. Every morning, Max would trot around the halls, checking on each guest and their pets as if he were the shelter's official ambassador. His presence was a calming force, reminding everyone that they were part of something larger than themselves. One morning, George found himself sitting at the small desk in the corner of the main hall, poring over a list of donations. Paul had gone to pick up supplies, leaving George in charge for the day. As George worked, he glanced up to see Max nosing at the leg of a teenage boy sitting on a bench. The boy, no older than 16, clutched a leash attached to a scruffy mutt who cowered behind his legs. George stood and approached them, his boots scuffing softly against the floor. "Morning," he said gently, offering a small smile. "New here?" The boy nodded, his eyes darting nervously around the room. I heard this place helps people with dogs. My mom said I couldn't keep him anymore, but I couldn't just leave him." George knelt to meet the boy's gaze, his voice steady. "You did the right thing coming here." "What's his name?" The boy hesitated before answering. "Spike." George extended a hand toward the dog, who sniffed it cautiously before wagging his tail. "He's a good boy," George said. "You both can stay as long as you need." The boy's shoulders sagged in relief, and for the first time, a tentative smile appeared on his face. "Thank you," he whispered. Meanwhile, the shelter was starting to draw attention from the community. Some neighbors were supportive, offering donations and volunteering their time. Others, however, were less welcoming. One afternoon, George overheard two men outside the shelter talking in hushed tones. "Don't see why they're wasting resources on a place like this," one of them muttered. "Those people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps." George's jaw tightened, but he held his tongue. Confrontation wouldn't change their minds. Instead, he channeled his frustration into making the shelter even better, determined to prove its worth through action. Paul returned later that day with a truckload of supplies, and George filled him in on the morning's events. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us," George admitted, leaning against the truck, "but I think we're making a difference." Paul clapped him on the shoulder. "You're doing great, George. This place wouldn't be what it is without you. And Max, of course." Max barked in agreement, wagging his tail as if to say, "We're a team." Over time, George began to notice changes in himself. He was more confident, more willing to take initiative. The routines that once felt daunting now gave him a sense of pride. He also found joy in small moments, watching a guest's face light up when their dog played with Max, or hearing a thank you from someone who finally felt safe after months of uncertainty. But it wasn't always easy. One evening, as George was locking up for the night, a woman arrived at the shelter with a bleeding arm and a terrified chihuahua in her arms. She was shaking, her eyes wide with fear. "They wouldn't let me stay," she said, her voice breaking. "All because of him. George guided her inside and helped her clean the wound while Max stayed close, sensing her distress. The woman explained that she had been turned away from another shelter because of her dog, leaving her with nowhere to go. As George listened, he felt a familiar pang of anger and sadness. He thought of all the times he had been turned away, how it felt to be treated as if he didn't matter. But here, in this place, things were different. Here, people mattered. Their stories mattered. "You're safe now," he told her, his voice firm. "Both of you." That night, as George sat on the porch with Max by his side, he reflected on how far they had come. The shelter wasn't perfect. There were still challenges to overcome, still skeptics to convince. But it was growing, evolving into a place of hope and healing. Max leaned against George, his golden fur warm under the porch light. George stroked his head, his thoughts drifting to the future. "We've got a good thing going here, buddy," he murmured. "Let's keep it that way." Max's tail thumped against the porch, his silent promise that they were in this together. As the weeks turned into months, the shelter became a hub of hope and resilience. But as the number of guests grew, so did the complexities of running such an operation. George Bews, while deeply committed, was learning firsthand that good intentions were not always enough. One morning, Paul called George into the small office they shared. A stack of bills sat on the desk, their corners curling under the weight of a coffee cup. "We're running low," Paul said, his usual cheer replaced by concern. "Donations have slowed, and with winter coming, we're going to need more supplies for both people and their dogs." George frowned, leaning against the doorway. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that we might need to start turning people away," Paul replied, his tone reluctant. The thought of denying anyone shelter made George's stomach churn. He had been in their shoes, cold, desperate, and carrying the weight of the world. The idea of sending someone back into that kind of uncertainty felt unbearable. "We'll figure something out," George said firmly. "We always do." As the day wore on, George mulled over possible solutions. Fundraisers, grant applications, even reaching out to local businesses for sponsorship, all seemed like distant possibilities, but they needed immediate action. Max, sensing George's unease, stayed close by, his golden eyes filled with quiet support. That evening, as George swept the main hall, a familiar figure walked through the door. It was the teenage boy, Josh, who had come with his dog Spike weeks earlier. But this time, he was carrying a guitar. "Thought I could help," Josh said, a shy smile tugging at his lips. "I've been playing on street corners for spare change. Figured if I did it here, maybe people would donate." George's heart swelled with pride. "That's a great idea, kid. Let's set you up." Word spread quickly, and within days, the shelter's front lawn became a gathering place. Josh played soulful tunes while Max sat proudly by his side, drawing in passers-by. People began stopping to listen, dropping money into a tin can labeled "for the shelter." George was amazed at how quickly the community rallied behind them, but not everyone was supportive. One afternoon, as a small crowd applauded Josh's performance, a man in a suit approached George. His stern expression and clipped tone were enough to put George on edge. "I'm here from the city council," the man announced, pulling out a badge. "We've received complaints about noise and traffic disruptions caused by your activities." George bristled. "We're just trying to help people. This shelter is all some of these folks have." The man raised an eyebrow. "While I sympathize, you need to adhere to city regulations. This setup might be violating zoning laws." The words hit George like a punch to the gut. "You're saying we might have to shut down?" "I'm saying you need to fix this," the man replied before walking away. For the first time since opening the shelter, George felt truly defeated. That evening, as he sat on the porch with Max, the weight of the situation bore down on him. Max rested his head on George's lap, his presence a reminder of how far they'd come. "I don't know what to do, boy," George admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. "Feels like we're fighting a losing battle." But Max, ever the optimist, nudged George's hand, his tail wagging gently as if to say, "Don't give up yet." The next day, Paul suggested they call a meeting with the shelter's residents. "If we're going to fight this, we need everyone on board," he said. George agreed, though he wasn't sure what they could accomplish. That evening, the shelter's guests gathered in the main hall. Josh sat with Spike at his feet. The young mother and her children were huddled in a corner, and the older man with the German shepherd leaned against the wall. George stood at the front, Max by his side. "We've hit a rough patch," George began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "But this place is worth fighting for. We're a family now, and families stick together." The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement. Josh raised his hand. "What can we do to help?" George smiled faintly. "We'll need ideas. Ways to raise funds, get the city council on our side, and prove that this shelter matters." Over the next few days, the shelter became a hive of activity. Paul reached out to local media, inviting them to see the work being done. Josh and the other residents organized a community open house, complete with live music, pet adoption events, and tours of the shelter. Max became the star attraction, charming visitors with his playful antics and unwavering loyalty. The open house was a resounding success. People who had once doubted the shelter's purpose began to see its value. A local journalist published a heartfelt article about George's journey and the shelter's impact, sparking an outpouring of support. Donations poured in, and volunteers offered their time and skills. But the fight wasn't over. George and Paul attended a city council meeting, armed with testimonials from shelter residents and letters from supporters. George, though nervous, spoke from the heart. "This shelter isn't just a roof over people's heads," he said, his voice steady. "It's a lifeline, a place where people and their dogs can find safety, dignity, and hope." As he spoke, Max sat at his feet, his presence a silent testament to the bond between humans and animals. After hours of deliberation, the council voted to grant the shelter an extension to address the zoning issues. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a step in the right direction. George left the meeting feeling lighter, his determination renewed. Back at the shelter, Max greeted him with an enthusiastic bark, as if sensing the progress. George knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "We're not done yet, buddy, but we're getting there." As the shelter continued its operations under the cloud of zoning issues, the pressure on George grew heavier. Despite the community support and the council's temporary extension, he couldn't shake the looming uncertainty of the shelter's future. Max, ever watchful, rarely left his side, a constant source of comfort amid the storm. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and planning, George found himself sitting alone in the shelter's common area. The room, usually filled with chatter and warmth, now seemed eerily quiet. Max sat at his feet, his head resting on George's worn boots. Paul entered, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to George before sitting across from him. "You've been awfully quiet today," Paul remarked, his tone light but laced with concern. George took a sip of the steaming coffee, his gaze distant. "Just thinking," he replied after a pause, "about what happens if this doesn't work out. If we lose the shelter." Paul frowned. "We're not losing it. Not without a fight." George sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's not just about me, Paul. These people, they're dogs. They're counting on us, and I can't help but feel like I'm letting them down." Paul's face softened. "You're not letting anyone down. Look around. This place exists because of you. You gave people hope when they had none." George shook his head. "Hope's not enough to keep the lights on." Meanwhile, Josh, who had been listening from the hallway, approached cautiously. "Can I talk to you guys?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Paul gestured for him to join them. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Josh sat down, his hands fidgeting nervously. "I've been thinking, maybe I could reach out to some of the people I've met while playing music. There's this guy who owns a recording studio. He's always said I had potential. Maybe he'd be willing to help us raise more money." George studied the teenager, his heart swelling with pride. "That's a big step, kid. You sure you want to do that?" Josh nodded firmly. "This place gave me and Spike a second chance. I want to give something back." Later that night, as the shelter quieted down and most residents retired to their rooms, George wandered outside with Max. The night air was crisp, the sky a tapestry of stars. He sat on the porch steps, scratching behind Max's ears. "You ever feel like the world's too heavy, boy?" George murmured. Max responded with a soft whine, nuzzling against his leg. As if on cue, Amanda, the young mother staying at the shelter, stepped outside. She carried a blanket over her shoulders and held a steaming cup of tea. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. George nodded, and she settled on the step beside him. "I saw you talking to Josh earlier," Amanda said after a moment of silence. "He really looks up to you, you know." George chuckled dryly. "Not sure why, I'm just an old man trying to keep things from falling apart." Amanda's gaze softened. You're more than that, George. You gave all of us a place to feel safe. That's not nothing. George looked down at Max, his hand still idly stroking the dog's golden fur. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing, taking on all of this. It's a lot. It is, Amanda agreed. But you're not alone. We're all in this together. Her words hung in the air, a quiet reminder of the community they had built. George felt a flicker of hope, fragile but present. The next day, Josh's plan began to take shape. With Paul's help, he contacted the recording studio owner, who agreed to record a single and organize a small concert to raise funds for the shelter. The shelter's residents rallied around the idea, helping Josh prepare and spreading the word. As the concert approached, the shelter buzzed with nervous excitement. Max, sensing the change in atmosphere, seemed more energetic than ever, his wagging tail and bright eyes lifting everyone's spirits. On the night of the concert, the venue, a local community center, was packed. George stood at the back, Max by his side, watching as Josh took the stage. The teenager's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone, but when he began to play, the room fell silent. Josh's voice was raw and powerful, each note carrying the weight of his journey. The audience was captivated, their expressions a mix of admiration and emotion. By the end of the performance, the room erupted in applause. George felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched Josh bow, Spike wagging his tail beside him. For the first time in weeks, George allowed himself to believe that they might just make it through this. Back at the shelter that night, Josh approached George. "Thanks for believing in me," he said, his voice quiet but steady. George placed a hand on the teenager's shoulder. "How you did that all on your own, kid. I'm proud of you." As Josh walked away, George turned to Max. "We're not done yet, boy. But tonight was a good night." As the shelter regained momentum after the city council's decision, new challenges arose, this time on a deeply personal level. George had always believed in the importance of offering second chances, but he hadn't anticipated how complicated those chances could become. One morning, as the sun filtered through the shelter's wide windows, Paul approached George with a hesitant expression. "We've got a new arrival," he said, motioning toward the entrance. George followed Paul to find a disheveled man sitting on a bench, clutching a leash attached to a scruffy terrier. The man's eyes darted nervously around the room, and he seemed to shrink under George's assessing gaze. "This is Rick," Paul introduced. "He's been on the streets for years. Says he heard about the shelter from someone in town." George extended a hand, but Rick hesitated before offering a weak shake. "You've got a spot for me and my dog?" Rick asked, his voice rough from years of hardship. George nodded. "We'll make room. But there are rules here, no fighting, no stealing, and everyone pitches in. Think you can manage that?" Rick gave a small nod, his grip tightening on the leash. "I'll try." Over the following days, it became clear that Rick was struggling to adjust. He kept to himself, often avoiding eye contact with other residents. His terrier, Toby, was equally wary, snapping at anyone who came too close. One evening, as George walked through the shelter's common area, he found Rick sitting alone, Toby curled at his feet. Max approached cautiously, his tail wagging in a friendly gesture, but Toby growled, baring his teeth. "Easy, boy," Rick muttered, patting Toby's head. "He's just saying hi." George sat down across from Rick, giving the man space. "You settling in okay?" he asked after a moment. Rick shrugged. "Takes time, I guess. Haven't been around this many people in years." George nodded, understanding all too well. "It's not easy, but you're not alone here. We're all in this together." Rick glanced at George, his expression softening slightly. "Thanks, means a lot." But Rick's journey wasn't without setbacks. A week later, Paul found him arguing with another resident over a misplaced blanket. The tension in the shelter was palpable as voices rose, drawing everyone's attention. "Hey," George barked, stepping between them. "What's going on here?" Rick's face was flushed with anger. "He took my blanket. I need it for Toby." The other man, an older resident named Marcus, shook his head. "I didn't take anything. I found it in the laundry." George raised a hand, silencing them both. "This isn't how we handle things here," he said firmly. Turning to Rick, he added, "Let's talk outside." Once outside, Rick paced back and forth, his frustration evident. "I'm trying, George," he said, his voice cracking, "but it's hard. I don't trust people. And Toby's all I've got. George placed a hand on Rick's shoulder, grounding him. I get it, he said softly. But you've got more than Toby now. You've got all of us. Let us help. Rick looked at George, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't know if I can, he admitted. You can, George replied, his voice steady. It's not easy, but you've already taken the first step. That's more than most people do. That evening, Rick approached Marcus and offered a quiet apology. The gesture, though small, marked a turning point. Slowly, Rick began opening up to the other residents, and Toby started warming up to the dogs around him, including Max. Max, ever the diplomat, seemed to take Toby under his wing. The two dogs became inseparable, their bond mirroring the growing trust between Rick and the shelter's community. Watching them, George felt a renewed sense of purpose. One particularly cold night, George found Rick sitting outside the shelter, staring up at the stars. Toby lay beside him, his small body pressed close for warmth. Everything okay? George asked, settling onto the steps. Rick nodded, though his expression was somber. Just thinking. I've spent so many years running, from people, from myself. I don't know if I can ever stop. George looked at him, his weathered face thoughtful. You've already stopped running, Rick. You're here. That's what matters. Rick let out a shaky breath. I'm scared, George. Scared of messing this up. Scared of letting Toby down. We're all scared, George admitted. But you don't have to do this alone. We've got your back. For the first time, Rick smiled, a small, tentative thing, but genuine. Thanks, George. I mean it. As the weeks went on, Rick became an integral part of the shelter. He started helping with daily chores, his mechanical skills proving invaluable in repairing broken fixtures. The residents began to see him not as an outsider, but as part of their family. George watched Rick's transformation with pride. The man who had once been closed off and defensive was now offering advice to newcomers and even teaching Josh how to fix a leaky faucet. Toby, too, had blossomed, his playful spirit bringing joy to everyone. One evening, as George sat by the fire with Max at his feet, Rick approached, holding a cup of coffee. I've been thinking, he said, his tone hesitant. Maybe I could help run things here. You know, pay it forward. George's smile was warm. I'd like that, Rick. I think you'd be good at it. As they sat in companionable silence, George felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The shelter wasn't just a place for people to find refuge. It was a place for them to rebuild their lives. And with people like Rick stepping up, its future felt brighter than ever. As winter tightened its icy grip on the city, life at the shelter became a delicate balancing act. The cold brought an influx of people and animals seeking refuge, stretching the shelter's resources thin. George, though seasoned at handling crises, couldn't ignore the growing strain on their small community. One biting January morning, Paul approached George with a grave expression. We've got a problem, he said, holding up an envelope. George frowned, taking the letter. Inside was a notice from the city, warning of an upcoming inspection. If the shelter doesn't meet updated health and safety standards, Paul explained, we could face fines, or worse, a shutdown. George sighed, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. How long do we have? 2 weeks, Paul replied. Barely enough time to address everything. The news spread quickly through the shelter, casting a shadow over the residents. Rick, who had become a trusted figure among them, pulled George aside. What can we do to help? He asked, his voice steady despite the tension. George hesitated before responding. There's a lot to fix, plumbing, heating, even some structural repairs, and we need to show the city that our operations are sustainable. Rick nodded. Then let's get to work. Under Rick's leadership, the shelter's residents rallied together. Those with carpentry skills repaired broken furniture and patched holes in the walls. Others cleaned tirelessly, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed. Even Toby and Max seemed to pitch in, their playful antics lifting spirits during the grueling process. Despite their best efforts, the challenges kept mounting. The heating system broke down one night, leaving everyone huddled together in blankets. George and Rick spent hours tinkering with the old furnace, their breath visible in the freezing air. We need a new system, Rick said finally, his tone grim. This one's beyond saving. George rubbed his temples. We can't afford it. Maybe we don't have to, Rick suggested. There's a hardware store downtown. The owner used to come here for community dinners. Maybe he'll donate a unit or at least give us a discount. The next morning, George and Rick visited the store, Max trotting faithfully beside them. The owner, a burly man named Sam, greeted them with a skeptical look. "George," he said, crossing his arms, "it's been a while. What brings you here?" George explained the situation, his voice measured but earnest. "We're doing everything we can, Sam, but we need help. The shelter means everything to these people." Sam glanced at Rick, then at Maxence, who wagged his tail hopefully. After a long pause, Sam sighed. "I'll see what I can do. No promises." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Sam eventually agreed to donate an older but functional heating unit, and Rick installed it with Paul's help. The warmth it brought to the shelter was both literal and symbolic, a beacon of hope in the coldest of times. As the inspection date approached, tensions rose again. The shelter's financial records were incomplete, and the city required proof of steady funding. George spent sleepless nights poring over receipts and donation logs, his frustration mounting. One evening, Rick found George slumped over the office desk, his head in his hands. "You look like you've been through the ringer," Rick said, setting down a steaming cup of coffee. "I'm trying to make sense of this mess," George replied wearily. "If we don't get these numbers right, it won't matter how clean the shelter is." Rick hesitated before speaking. "What if we held a fundraiser? Something to get the community involved?" George looked up, his eyes narrowing. "A fundraiser in less than a week?" "Why not?" Rick said with a shrug. "We've got a lot of goodwill in this town. People know the work we do. Let's remind them." The next day, Rick and Paul set the wheels in motion, organizing a Paws and People event at the shelter. Flyers were printed and distributed, local businesses donated supplies, and word spread quickly through social media. The event featured games for kids, a bake sale, and a showcase of the shelter's dogs, with Max as the star attraction. Residents and volunteers worked tirelessly to prepare, their shared sense of purpose invigorating the group. When the day arrived, the shelter buzzed with activity. Families lined up to meet the dogs, children played tug-of-war with Max, and Rick manned the grill, flipping burgers with surprising skill. The atmosphere was electric, a testament to the shelter's resilience. Toward the end of the event, George stood before the crowd, a microphone in hand. "This shelter isn't just a roof over our heads," he began, his voice filled with emotion. "It's a place where second chances happen, where people and animals find hope and family. We can't do this without you." Applause erupted, and donation jars quickly filled with cash. By the time the event ended, the shelter had raised enough funds to meet the city's requirements and cover additional repairs. That night, as the residents celebrated their success, George pulled Rick aside. "You made this happen," he said, his tone grateful. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Rick smiled, his expression humble. "You gave me a second chance, George. This is my way of giving back." As they stood in the warm glow of the shelter's lights, Max and Toby curled up together nearby. George felt a renewed sense of hope. The inspection loomed, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like they had a fighting chance. As the shelter settled into its newfound harmony, life seemed to have taken on a rhythm that was almost predictable. George and Rick worked together to maintain the operations, while Max and Toby continued their nightly patrols, ensuring everyone felt safe. But beneath the surface of this growing community, a storm was brewing, one that would test their resilience and unity. It began one frosty evening when George received a letter marked with the City Council's emblem. As he opened it, his heart sank. The council had decided to re-evaluate the shelter's zoning permit due to recent concerns raised by neighboring businesses. Essentially, the shelter was once again at risk of being shut down. Rick found George sitting on the front porch, the letter clutched in his hand. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. George handed him the letter without a word. Rick's brow furrowed as he read it, his jaw tightening. "They can't do this. Not after everything we've done." "They can, and they are," George said, his voice heavy. "We've got 30 days to prove we're not a nuisance, or they'll revoke our permit." Rick's fists clenched. "This place saved my life, George. It's saving a lot of lives. We can't let them take it away." As news of the letter spread through the shelter, a wave of anxiety rippled through the residents. Some began packing their belongings, fearing they'd be forced back onto the streets. Others rallied around George, determined to fight for their home. Max, sensing the tension, stayed close to George. his amber eyes filled with concern. Toby, ever the follower, mirrored Max's vigilance, growling softly at anyone who seemed overly agitated. Rick took it upon himself to galvanize the residents. "We've got a month," he said during an impromptu meeting in the common area. "That's plenty of time to show the council what this place means, not just to us, but to the whole community." Rick's resolve inspired a flurry of activity. Some residents began drafting letters to the council, while others reached out to local businesses and churches, asking for support. Even Josh, who usually kept to himself, volunteered to create a video showcasing the shelter's impact, capturing testimonials from residents and neighbors alike. But the pressure mounted as the days ticked by. One evening, George found Rick in the kitchen, his hands trembling as he gripped a cup of coffee. "You okay?" George asked, placing a reassuring hand on Rick's shoulder. Rick exhaled shakily. "I'm just scared, George. What if it's not enough? What if we lose everything?" George met Rick's gaze, his own eyes steady. "We've been through worse, and we've come out stronger every time. Trust in that." Rick nodded, though the doubt lingered in his eyes. I don't want to let anyone down." "You won't," George said firmly, "because you're not doing this alone." Meanwhile, Max and Toby became an unlikely duo in their own right. During the nights, they patrolled the shelter grounds together, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. It was as if Max had taken Toby under his wing, teaching him the ropes of being a protector. One night, as George watched them from his window, he felt a pang of pride. These dogs weren't just companions, they were symbols of the resilience and hope that defined the shelter. But not everyone in the community was supportive of their efforts. One morning, George found graffiti scrawled across the shelter's front wall. "Keep out." The words were large and menacing, dripping with fresh paint. The sight sent a chill down George's spine. He called Rick and Paul over, their expressions darkening as they took in the message. "Looks like someone wants us gone," Rick muttered, his fists clenching. Paul nodded grimly. "We should report this to the police." George hesitated. "We can't let this intimidate us. It's just paint. We clean it up and move on." Rick stepped forward, his voice firm. "No, this is more than paint. It's a threat. Whoever did this thinks they can scare us into giving up. We need to show them they're wrong." Later that day, a local news crew arrived, tipped off by one of the shelter's supporters. As the reporter interviewed George Day Rickwire and several residents, the graffiti loomed in the background, a stark reminder of the opposition they faced. "This shelter isn't just a building," George said, his voice steady despite the tension. "It's a lifeline. It's proof that people can change, that second chances matter. We're not going anywhere." Rick, standing beside him, nodded. "We've faced worse than this, and we've come out stronger every time." The news segment aired that evening, painting the shelter in a sympathetic light. Calls of support poured in from viewers across the city, lifting the residents' spirits. But the graffiti incident left a lingering sense of unease. As the 30-day deadline approached, tensions within the shelter reached a boiling point. Arguments flared over minor issues, and some residents began doubting their chances of success. George called a meeting, his voice firm but calm as he addressed the group. "I know things feel impossible right now," he said, "but we've come too far to give up. This shelter has survived because of all of you. Your courage, your strength, your hope. Let's show the council what that means." Rick stepped forward, his voice steady. "We've got one more chance to make our case. Let's make it count." That night, as George lay awake, he heard the soft shuffle of paws outside his door. Opening it, he found Max and Toby sitting together, their expressions almost solemn. George knelt down, ruffling their fur. "Don't worry, boys," he murmured. "We'll get through this." The pressure of the looming deadline forced everyone at the shelter to dig deeper, both emotionally and physically. The efforts to save their home became a shared mission, weaving tighter bonds among the residents, George, Rick, and even the dogs, Max and Toby. One morning, while Rick worked on compiling their final presentation for the city council, he heard a knock on the door. It was Josh, holding a flash drive in one hand and a notebook in the other. His usual nervous demeanor was replaced by a rare sense of confidence. "I finished the video," Josh said, his voice steady. "And I wrote down everything I think we should say." Rick raised an eyebrow. "Everything," Josh nodded. "People need to see the truth, what this place means to us. I even interviewed some of the neighbors who support us. They said they'd speak up if needed. Rick smiled, clapping a hand on Josh's shoulder. Good work, man. Let's see what you've got. The video was raw but powerful, blending testimonials from residents with footage of the shelter's day-to-day life. Josh had included clips of Max and Toby guarding the shelter at night, their loyalty underscoring the shelter's mission to provide protection and hope. Meanwhile, Paul had taken it upon himself to rally the residents for the final push. He created a roster to ensure everyone contributed in some way, whether it was cleaning the shelter, preparing food, or reaching out to supporters. Even those who had initially doubted their chances found themselves drawn into the collective effort. Max and Toby became symbols of resilience for the group. Max, with his steadfast gaze and protective instincts, embodied the strength they aspired to. Toby, still growing into his role, reminded them that even the smallest acts of courage could make a difference. One evening, as the residents gathered for dinner, Paul shared a surprising story. "You all know I was in a bad place when I first came here," he began, his voice steady. "But it was Max who made me realize I wasn't alone. The way he'd sit with me, like he knew what I was going through, it changed something in me." The room fell silent as Paul's words sank in. Then Rick spoke up. "That's what this place does. It changes people. And we need to show the council that." As the days dwindled, the shelter received an unexpected visit. Margaret, the owner of a nearby bakery, arrived with boxes of pastries and a determined look on her face. "I saw the news segment," she said to George. "This shelter has been a blessing to the community, whether people admit it or not. I want to help." Margaret's support proved invaluable. She reached out to her network of small business owners, many of whom were willing to vouch for the shelter. Some even offered to donate food and supplies for an upcoming open house event, aimed at showing the council the shelter's positive impact. The open house became a major focus for the group. Josh worked on polishing his video, while Rick and George planned a tour to showcase the shelter's facilities. Paul and a few others prepared speeches, and even some of the quieter residents found ways to contribute. The night before the open house, George sat alone in his office, going over the final details. Max and Toby lay at his feet, their quiet presence a source of comfort. Rick knocked on the door and entered, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You've been at this all day," Rick said, setting a mug in front of George. "Time to take a breather." George leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I just want this to go well. We can't afford to mess up." Rick sat across from him, his expression calm. "It will, because we've done everything we can, and because this place is worth fighting for." George smiled faintly, reaching down to pat Max's head. "It's not just about the shelter. It's about all of us. What we've built here." Rick nodded. "And we're not losing it. Not without a fight." The open house was a resounding success. Dozens of people showed up, including neighbors, local business owners, and even a few members of the city council. Margaret's pastries were a hit, and Josh's video brought several attendees to tears. But the highlight of the event came when Max and Toby were introduced. Rick shared the story of how Max had saved him, while George talked about how Toby had learned from Max to protect the shelter. The dog's loyalty and courage resonated deeply with everyone in the room. By the end of the day, the shelter had received multiple letters of support and pledges of financial aid. More importantly, the event had united the community behind their cause. That night, as the residents celebrated, George found himself standing on the porch watching the stars. Rick joined him, leaning against the railing. "You did good today," Rick said, his voice warm. "We all did," George replied. He looked down at Max and Toby, who lay side by side, their eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Even them," Rick chuckled. "Especially them." The morning after the open house, the shelter was buzzing with optimism. The success of the event had lifted everyone's spirits, and for the first time in weeks, there was a genuine sense of hope. However, the looming city council meeting was still a daunting challenge, and tensions were high as the final decision approached. George stood at the center of the common room, holding a clipboard and addressing the group. "The open house was a great step forward, but it's not the end. The council meeting is tomorrow, and we need to make sure we're fully prepared." Rick nodded in agreement. "They'll ask tough questions, and we need to have clear answers. We can't afford to let our emotions get the best of us." Paul, usually stoic, raised his hand. "What if they bring up the complaints? You know, the ones about the noise and the stray animals?" George sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "We've addressed those issues as much as we can. The improvements we've made to the shelter, along with the letters of support we've received, should help counteract those arguments, but we need to stay calm and stick to the facts." Josh, sitting in the corner with his laptop, chimed in. "I've got all the footage from the open house edited and ready to go. It shows everything: the community support, the positive impact on residents, and Max and Toby's role in keeping the shelter safe." George smiled at Josh. "Good work. That video might just be the turning point." As the meeting drew closer, the pressure began to weigh heavily on everyone. Paul and Rick rehearsed their speeches late into the night, while Josh meticulously went over the video to ensure there were no glitches. Margaret stopped by with more pastries and a few encouraging words, but even her cheerful presence couldn't completely dispel the nervous energy. Max and Toby seemed to sense the tension. Max, ever the protector, stayed close to George, his watchful eyes scanning the room as if guarding against unseen threats. Toby, still learning from his mentor, followed Max's lead, occasionally nudging the residents with his nose as if to comfort them. The day of the meeting arrived, and the shelter's residents gathered in the courtyard ready to head to City Hall. George stood at the front, his calm demeanor masking the anxiety he felt. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever happens today, know that we've done everything we could. No matter the outcome, I'm proud of all of you." The group piled into 2 vans, with Max and Toby riding in the back of George's truck. The drive to City Hall was silent, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the air. As they approached the imposing building, George glanced at the dogs in his rearview mirror. "This is for all of us," he murmured. Inside the council chamber, the atmosphere was tense. The room was packed with supporters of the shelter, along with a few vocal opponents. The council members sat at a long table at the front, their expressions neutral as they prepared to hear the case. George, Rick and Paul took their places at the podium, with Josh ready to play the video at the appropriate moment. Max and Toby remained outside, under the care of a volunteer, but their absence felt palpable to those who knew their significance. The council chair, an imposing woman with a stern expression, called the meeting to order. "We are here to discuss the future of the community shelter on Maple Street. Mr. George Harris, you have the floor." George stepped forward, his heart pounding. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "Thank you, Madam Chair. For over a decade, this shelter has been a haven for people and animals alike. It's not just a place to sleep. It's a place to heal, to rebuild, and to find hope." As George spoke, he could feel the weight of the room's attention on him. He outlined the shelter's contributions to the community, from providing jobs to offering a safe space for those in need. He emphasized the changes they had made to address complaints and highlighted the overwhelming support they had received during the open house. When it was Rick's turn to speak, he shared his personal story of how Max had saved his life and how the shelter had given him a second chance. Paul followed, his voice steady as he described the sense of purpose he had found in working at the shelter. Finally, Josh played the video. The room fell silent as the footage rolled, showing the faces of residents, volunteers, and community members who had rallied behind the shelter. The video ended with a shot of Max and Toby standing side by side, their eyes filled with unwavering loyalty. As the council deliberated, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. George clenched his fists, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Rick sat with his head bowed, silently praying, while Josh tapped his foot nervously. The council chair finally called the room to order. "We've reviewed the evidence and listened to the arguments presented today. While we acknowledge the concerns raised by some members of the community, we cannot overlook the positive impact this shelter has had on so many lives." George held his breath as the chair continued. "It is the decision of this council that the shelter be granted a 1-year extension to its lease, with the possibility of renewal pending further review." The room erupted in applause as the shelter's supporters cheered and hugged one another. George felt tears sting his eyes as the relief washed over him. Rick clapped him on the back, grinning from ear to ear. "We did it, George." As they left the chamber, Max and Toby greeted them with wagging tails and joyful barks. George knelt beside Max, scratching his ears. "How you were part of this too, boy," he said softly. "We couldn't have done it without you." As the shelter's team left City Hall, a wave of relief swept over them, but they knew the real work was just beginning. The council's decision granted them a one-year extension, but it came with a stipulation. They had to demonstrate measurable improvements in community relations and financial stability to secure a permanent lease. Back at the shelter, George gathered the group in the common room. The atmosphere was a mix of celebration and determination. "We've won a battle, but not the war," George began. "The council gave us a chance, but we have to prove we deserve it. That means showing them this place is more than just a shelter. It's a cornerstone of our community." Rick leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "What's the plan, George? We've got a year, but we can't waste a second." Paul spoke up, his voice steady. "We need to build on the momentum we've created. The open house showed people what we're about. Now we need to keep them engaged, bring them into the shelter's story." The group brainstormed late into the night, with Max and Toby lying contentedly by the fireplace. Ideas flowed freely. Community events, partnerships with local businesses, and outreach programs to address the lingering concerns about noise and stray animals. Margaret, who had become an unofficial advisor, suggested organizing a monthly community cleanup to demonstrate the shelter's commitment to the neighborhood. "I'll talk to the diner staff," she said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "We can sponsor some of the events and get the word out." George nodded, jotting down notes. "That's a great idea, Margaret, and Rick, Paul, let's start planning workshops. People need to see the skills and value we bring to the table." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The shelter hosted its first community cleanup, with residents, volunteers, and even a few neighbors joining in. Max and Toby, wearing bright vests that read "Shelter Ambassadors," became the stars of the event, drawing smiles and breaking down barriers with their playful antics. As the shelter's visibility grew, so did its supporters. A local vet clinic offered free checkups for pets in need, and a small bakery donated proceeds from a special Max and Toby cookie sale to the shelter. The initiatives didn't just raise funds, they changed perceptions. Not everyone, however, was convinced. Clyde, the grumpy neighbor who had been vocal about his complaints, remained a thorn in their side. One afternoon, he confronted George as he was walking Max and Toby near the shelter. "This doesn't change anything, George," Clyde grumbled, pointing to a flyer about the shelter's recent achievements. "You can dress this place up all you want, but it's still a nuisance." George sighed, keeping his composure. "Clyde, I know you've had your reservations, but I'd like you to see what we're doing firsthand. Why not come to our next event? Meet the people here. See how much good this place is doing." Clyde crossed his arms, his scowl deepening. "We'll see," he muttered before walking away. Despite resistance from a few, the shelter continued to thrive. Toby, inspired by Max's unwavering loyalty, had begun to shine in his own right. He became a companion to the children who visited the shelter, his playful nature bringing joy to families in need. Max, ever the protector, kept watch over the grounds, his presence a constant source of comfort and safety. One evening, as George prepared for bed, a knock at the door startled him. Opening it, he found Clyde standing there, holding a basket of vegetables from his garden. "I thought about what you said," Clyde began, his tone gruff but sincere. "I'll come to your next event. No promises, though." George smiled, extending his hand. "That's all I ask. Thank you, Clyde." The following weekend, Clyde attended the shelter's Family Day event, a mix of games, food, and live music. He watched from a distance as Max and Toby greeted visitors, their tails wagging enthusiastically. Clyde's scowl softened as he saw Toby playing with a group of children, his playful barks ringing out like music. Margaret approached him with a plate of homemade cookies. "You look like you could use one of these, she said with a warm smile. Clyde hesitated before taking a cookie. "Thanks," he said, his voice quieter than usual. For the first time, he stayed until the end of the event, even helping to clean up after the crowd had dispersed. As the months went by, the shelter's impact continued to grow. Clyde, once their staunchest critic, began volunteering, his gruff demeanor softening with each interaction. Max and Toby remained at the heart of the shelter's success, their bond inspiring everyone who met them. George, in watching it all unfold, couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The shelter had become more than he'd ever imagined, a symbol of resilience, community, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Winter arrived in the city, blanketing everything in a soft layer of snow. The shelter had come a long way since its precarious situation months earlier, but the final test loomed on the horizon, the annual council review that would determine whether the lease would be permanently extended. As the date approached, George and the team worked tirelessly to finalize their report. They compiled testimonials from community members, financial records showing the shelter's improved stability, and documentation of their outreach programs. The night before the review, the shelter hosted a candlelit vigil as a final act of gratitude and hope. The vigil, held in the snowy courtyard, drew dozens of supporters. Families with adopted pets, volunteers, and even skeptics like Clyde gathered, each holding a candle. Max and Toby stood beside George, their golden fur glowing in the flickering light. Margaret led the group in a quiet song of hope, her voice carrying over the still night. Despite the warm atmosphere, George couldn't shake his nerves. As the crowd dispersed, he remained by the fire pit staring into the embers. Max approached, pressing his head against George's hand, and Toby soon joined, curling up at George's feet. "We've done everything we can, boys," George whispered, stroking their fur. "Now it's out of our hands." The next morning, George stood outside City Hall accompanied by Rickard, Paul, and Margaret. The air was biting, and George's breath clouded before him as he stared at the imposing doors. Max and Toby, though not allowed inside, stayed close by, their eyes fixed on George with unwavering loyalty. Inside the council chamber, the atmosphere was tense. Council members shuffled papers, their expressions unreadable. One by one, George and the team presented their case. Margaret spoke passionately about the shelter's role in the community, while Rick highlighted the financial turnaround. Finally, George took a deep breath and addressed the room. "This shelter isn't just a place for stray dogs or struggling people," he began, his voice steady. "It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together. Max and Toby are proof of that. They've taught us about loyalty, courage, and love, qualities we've tried to reflect in every step we've taken this year." As George concluded, the council members exchanged hushed whispers. The mayor, a stern man with a reputation for pragmatism, stood and addressed the room. "Thank you for your presentation. We will deliberate and notify you of our decision shortly." The wait felt eternal. George and the team sat in a nearby cafe, nursing cups of coffee, while Max and Toby waited patiently outside. Every time the door opened, George's heart jumped, only to sink when it wasn't the council messenger. Finally, a young clerk approached, holding an envelope. "Mr. George Carter?" she asked. George stood, his hands trembling as he took the envelope. The team huddled around him as he carefully opened it. The letter was brief, but its words brought tears to George's eyes. "The council has voted to grant the shelter a permanent lease," he read aloud, his voice breaking. The cafe erupted into cheers, and Margaret hugged George tightly. Back at the shelter, the news spread like wildfire. Supporters and volunteers flooded in to celebrate, bringing food, decorations, and warm congratulations. Max and Toby received more attention than ever, with children draping them in ribbons and flowers. Clyde, holding a tray of hot cocoa, approached George with an uncharacteristically sheepish grin. "Guess I was wrong about this place," he admitted. "You've done something real special here." George smiled, clinking his mug against Clyde's. "Takes a village, Clyde, and now you're part of ours." As the sun set on the celebration, George stood in the courtyard, watching as Max and Toby played with a group of children. The shelter had not only survived, but had become a cornerstone of the community. George felt a deep sense of gratitude for everyone who had made it possible, but especially for the two dogs who had started it all. The celebration at the shelter continued late into the evening. As the fire pit blazed in the courtyard, George felt a profound sense of fulfillment watching the community come together. Max and Toby were at the center of it all, tails wagging as they basked in the warmth of the people they had helped bring together. Amid the festivities, a woman in her late 30s approached George, her face a mixture of nervousness and hope. She introduced herself as Dr. Emily Harper, a veterinarian who had recently moved back to the city. She had been following the shelter's journey and was inspired by its transformation. "I wanted to meet the man behind this incredible place," Emily said, her voice earnest. "And these two amazing dogs," George chuckled, scratching Max behind the ears. "They're the real heroes," he said, nodding toward Toby as well. "I'm just trying to keep up with them." Emily smiled, kneeling to pet the dogs. "I was wondering if you'd consider expanding the shelter's services," she continued. "With my experience, I could help set up an on-site veterinary clinic. We could treat animals in need and even offer spay and neuter services to prevent overpopulation." George's eyes widened. The idea was brilliant, a natural next step for the shelter. "That's incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd be honored to work with you." Emily nodded, her excitement evident. "Let's make it happen." The evening took another unexpected turn when a young boy, no older than 10, shyly approached George. He held a small notebook clutched to his chest and looked nervously at Max and Toby. George knelt down to meet his gaze. "Hi there," George said gently. "What's your name?" "Liam," the boy replied softly. He hesitated before holding out the notebook. "I wrote this for Max and Toby." George opened the notebook and found a heartfelt letter written in uneven handwriting. Liam wrote about how Max and Toby's story had inspired him to believe in kindness and bravery, even when life felt hard. He ended the letter with, "Thank you for showing me that being strong doesn't mean being alone." George felt his throat tighten as he read. He looked at Liam, his voice thick with emotion. "This is beautiful, Liam. Thank you." Liam's face lit up as George handed him a pen. "Could you sign it for me? And maybe Max and Toby could sign too." George chuckled, guiding Liam to press one of Max's paws onto the page. Toby followed suit, leaving 2 paw prints beside George's signature. Liam beamed, clutching the notebook tightly. As the celebration wound down and guests began to leave, George found himself alone with Max and Toby. The fire pit's embers glowed faintly, casting a warm light over the courtyard. George leaned back in his chair, looking up at the stars. "You two have changed everything," he said softly, his voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and wonder. "Not just for me, but for this entire community." Max nuzzled George's hand, while Toby lay his head on George's lap, his soft brown eyes filled with trust. The bond between them was unbreakable, forged in hardship and solidified in love. As George sat there, a shooting star streaked across the sky. He closed his eyes, silently thanking whatever force had brought Max and Toby into his life. He knew the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges to face, but he felt ready to meet them, knowing he wasn't alone. The morning after the celebration, George woke up to the sound of birds chirping and Max's excited barking. He stepped outside to see Toby and Max playing in the yard, their joyful energy filling the crisp morning air. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind, and a smile tugged at his lips. The shelter was now more than just a safe haven for animals. It had become a beacon of hope for the entire community. George reflected on how far they had come since that fateful night when Max had entered his life. What had started as a reluctant act of kindness had blossomed into a mission of compassion and renewal, fueled by the bond he shared with his 2 loyal companions. The new veterinary clinic began taking shape quickly, thanks to Dr. Harper's dedication and the support of volunteers inspired by the shelter's story. Emily worked tirelessly to turn her vision into reality, and within weeks, the clinic was ready to open its doors. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew a crowd, and Max and Toby, sporting bright red bandanas, stole the show as the shelter's official mascots. Children who had once been afraid of dogs now flocked to the shelter, eager to meet the 2 heroes they had heard so much about. Liam became a frequent visitor, helping to feed the animals and learning about their care. He even started a small fundraiser at his school, collecting supplies and donations for the shelter. "You've got quite the team here," Emily remarked to George one afternoon as they watched the dogs play with the children. "Max and Toby have a way of bringing out the best in everyone." George nodded, his expression thoughtful. "They remind us of what really matters," he said. "Love, loyalty, and the courage to make a difference." As time went on, the shelter expanded its outreach, hosting adoption events and community workshops on responsible pet ownership. Families from all over the area came to meet the animals, many of whom found their forever homes. The shelter's success became a point of pride for the town, and even the most skeptical residents came to appreciate its impact. One evening, as George sat on the porch with Max and Toby, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, the hardships they had faced together, the lives they had touched, and the love they had shared had all been worth it. "Looks like we've built something pretty special here," George said, scratching Max's ears. Toby barked in agreement, his tail wagging furiously. Max leaned against George's side, his warm presence a reminder of the incredible bond they had forged. Toby lay at George's feet, his soft snores blending with the gentle hum of the evening. The farm was quiet, but it felt alive, filled with the promise of new beginnings. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, George raised his glass of iced tea in a silent toast. To Max, to Toby, and to the journey that had changed all their lives. Do you believe in the power of love and loyalty, just like Max and Toby showed? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an inspiring story like this one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next adventure.